So thanks for coming along, everyone. And the cases I'm going to talk to you about tonight span back over a few years, probably about 5 years. And some of them are quite unusual in that they have features that you may or may not have heard before. And I guess when I tell them to you, like me, you may wonder, well, are these really extraterrestrials that these people are interacting with, or what the heck is really going on? So the first case that I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm sorry I don't have a slideshow because these are just people's personal stories, but this was of someone, he reported it to me on the 13th of August 2015. And I actually knew him through somebody, I got to know him through somebody else. So, and then he rang me. He was an older gentleman who at the time, in 2015, he was probably about 70. And not that 70 is old, but I'm just saying that he told me the story of when he was a young boy and he was living in a village in Scotland. And in the village, this particular village had 2 train lines going through it. And his house was a short distance from the park. And he said there were no magazines available at the time, no TV, no radio. And he was 4.5 years old. So keep that in mind when I tell you about his description. What he did was he walked between 2 houses to the park, and he saw 2 balls of light hovering above the railway lines, and he got the strangest feeling that they contained all the knowledge of the universe, which is very unusual for a 4.5-year-old. Then the ground under the railway line opened up, and next thing he finds himself on a moving platform with a being standing on the right-hand side and another on the left. He didn't give me any description of those at the time because I'm madly scribbling down over the phone while he's telling me. Anyway, he found himself inside a tunnel about the height of, estimated the ceiling of the tunnel was 12 feet high with a smoothly arched roof, and there was light softly emanating from the roof and the walls. And we've heard that before in some of people's reports of being inside spaceships, where there's light emanating, but there's actually no point of origin of that light. Anyway, there was no talking and all communication was telepathic. And on the right side of the platform he was standing, on the right side of the platform he was standing on, there was a railing. They came to the end and stepped into a cavern where another type of being was standing. And he saw 2 groups of 8 to 12 beings who stopped what they were doing and looked at him. And he said to me there was a look on their faces of great expectation, but also of hope, which as an adult he reflected on and thought it was really unusual. Anyway, he felt like he was supposed to do something for them, but he didn't know what that was. Anyway, he turned to his left and he saw the back wall of the cavern and saw a rocky outcrop come out of the wall, and down to ground level. There was a light behind the outcrop, but he couldn't see the source. Now, one piece of the rock was different to the rest, and it was perpendicular in shape. It was a red-brown colour, and it felt like sandpaper. And it was a big piece of rock. And suddenly, a large entrance opened up in the rock, and there was a light coming from the entrance. And he saw 3 beings facing him, and one looked like a man, and the other was a being of pure white light. And the light was so intense, it was hard for him to distinguish any features. And the third being was pure white light, but 3 to 4 times larger than the others. Now, he was taken into the entrance by the beings by a passage off to the right. And he saw more rooms, and they were a lot larger and full of light. At this stage, one being left, and he was told many things but can't remember them. He does remember being given fruit of some kind, which he just couldn't quite remember what that was. He then found himself facing backward with on the platform, and described the light as so intense he felt like he could grab a handful of it. And then there were 3 more beings appeared and watched him leave. So that's an interesting story. And I don't know what it is. And maybe you'll have some thoughts about it after we finish this, and you can share those thoughts. But, you know, he was older than 70. He was probably more like 75 or so, but he spent all those years of his life, he hadn't told anybody about this experience. For some reason, he told me, and he was 4.5 at the time, so maybe some elements of the story were, you know, a little bit fuzzy. I'm not really sure, but when you have a really, you know, unusual experience like that, particularly as a child, it does imprint itself on you. And the feelings about it stay with you. Anyway, he goes on and he says that age 12, he was an altar boy. And on one occasion, he got an intense feeling to go into the chapel, but he really preferred to play. But the intense feeling occurred 3 times before he eventually succumbed to the promptings. And when he entered the chapel, there was no one there. And his attention was drawn to the statue of St. Patrick, which had an intense golden light around its hand. And while he was watching, incredibly, the gold light showed him all the faces of everyone he'd been to school with and what they would become, every position in life that they would achieve. Pretty amazing. The instant he made a decision of what he wanted to be, he felt something leave, and he knew the choice he made couldn't be undone, not even by God, he said. And from that time, he felt he couldn't relate to people, although they were standing right next to him. So he's had another experience that made him feel very different to other people. And he was a very shy person. He was actually someone who would go to a spiritual group with my late husband, actually. And he was just very shy, a very quiet, softly spoken demeanor. So I guess, you know, his experiences shaped him over the years. Anyway, he told me of another experience. It was about 23 to 25 years ago, which was from 2015. When he told me the stories. And he said it was during summer. And he woke up on a Saturday morning early with an itchy right leg. And it felt like all his nerves were joining together. And he found a 7 to 8 inch long scar that was healed and had no stitches. And he remembered being taken somewhere with a bright light and something being placed in his leg and taken away. And he described his escorts at the time as beings of like elements, angels, and ascended masters. And he feels like he's always been looked after and helped. So he had a very interesting story to tell. I don't know what you think about that, but just remember those stories, maybe make some notes if you want to talk about that afterwards. Another case was of a woman. She phoned on the 28th of January 2016. And she said, she described herself as a Christian who fell in love with God as a child. That in itself is fascinating to me. But on the 18th of December 2015, she was sitting on the beach stargazing. And the next night, she was laying on the porch looking at the sky and asking God in her own mind, is it okay to stargaze, you know? And I don't know why she was asking that. There may have been more to that. And at the time, I didn't sort of pick up on it. I should have delved more into that more deeply. But anyway, after 1 hour, she was getting cold, but she saw 2 flashes in the sky. And she was tired, so she went to bed. The next day, about lunchtime, she looked out again to see something flashing again. And she kept watching it and thought something wasn't right about it. But she started feeling happy and asked in her mind, "Are you the same light as from last night?" And it seemed to respond to her thoughts. And we have this, don't we, in when people practice CE5s, that they've will put out a thought to something that they're seeing, and it seems to respond to their thoughts. Whether it does or not is another thing in all cases, but it certainly does seem to be that way in some cases. Anyway, she had attention span problems that day due to a painful neck, so she didn't give much more detail and didn't really remember much more detail about it. But in July 2014, she woke to see something slither out of her room. That's what she said. And she looked to the window and she saw a blackness with multicolored stars in it. And she said she screamed at it 4 times, so she knew she was awake. So we wasn't dreaming at all. But her dog remained asleep, which was really unusual because if she was screaming out, then her dog would certainly respond, normally anyway. Whatever she was seeing was the same size as her dog, which was a Bichon Frise. And if you know those dogs, they're a small to average size dog, depending on, well, they're probably a little more towards a large, small dog, put it that way. It was floating at window height and she couldn't see through it, and it had a Casper ghost shape to it at the bottom. You know how it sort of comes around in a swirl and peters off into it pinches off. And she saw it for 15 seconds and then it moved through the closed window and disappeared. And she got up and gently woke the dog to see if it was all right, but it seemed dazed. She remembered her father had told her that he'd seen a spaceship when he was sitting on the balcony. And she said her father would never lie about that, but unfortunately he had since died, so there was no checking his story for more detail. But from there, memories started flooding back about her life, and she remembered seeing a tall person in their backyard who she would later see often when she was in her teens. And at age 8, she was with her sister when they saw a ship in the backyard hovering over their house. And the ship had lights and they could see the occupants. So it must have been really low. I didn't write all of that right down in my notes, but I'm sure I talked to her about that. She described them as short beings and maybe green or brownish in colour. She knew she and her sister were taken, but has no memory of what happened or of being returned. Now, her sister used to scream that there were monsters in the room, but the sister remembered this extremely tall man in the backyard who would come to get her often. Now, I guess that these girls were pretty frightened and they were telling their parents about this. So if her father put bolts on the back door, and they would make sure that they would lock them every night. And I can imagine a parent, doing something like that to appease the fears of their children. But that didn't stop whatever was going on, because a big piece of her ear, about the size of a 1-cent piece, went missing, basically. And she actually later had to have plastic surgery to make it whole. And we know that comes up with people who are abducted, and they'll have scoop marks and things like that, where parts of their body will disappear. Anyway, she kept seeing ships in the sky, sometimes 20 at a time. And in January or February 2015, they were turning up a lot. And on one occasion, one particular ship illuminated her and she felt like she was being scanned. It felt to her like it was focusing on her head and knew everything about her. And she kept telling herself, "I don't believe this." And she kept thinking these words to herself: believe, hope, faith, and love. Believe, hope, faith, and love. And she said she was actually singing these words to herself. And I guess they might have grown out of her Christian background, why she picked those words. And as she was doing those words, as she was saying those words to herself, an amber light came down to under the cloud. And she said she felt total awe at seeing this light. And then the light went back up into the sky. And then she heard the words in her mind, "Be brave." Interesting in itself. After this, she had she claimed she had interactions with what she called interdimensionals, that she described as white orbs appearing 2 meters from her. And she felt like they were having a closer look at her, and she could feel their power, which she felt was supernatural, which scared her. And she asked them to stay back a bit because they were scaring her and they were too spooky for her to deal with. She'd started waking up during her abduction experiences, and she'd wake up to see the ceiling open and then become aware of being put back in bed. Now, I don't know how many of you might have read the communion letters, but in the back of that book by Anne and Whitley Strieber, there is a chapter called, I think it's called The Dead. Some years ago, there was a woman, the woman who actually ran the Ipswich UFO group for a while, that was Desley Piscini, who's now passed away. She told me that she had been in hospital and she had seen, I think it was, she had seen the floor below her sort of open up. So, I mean, that could have been due to drugs. I'm not really sure, but I don't think so, knowing Desley. But anyway, so she told me that too. Anyway, now where was I? Yes, the beings during these encounters were about 1.5 meters tall with beautiful eyes. And she described them as having perfect skin, a slender nose, and were blue in colour. And I've heard of these blue beings being described before. And she described them as beautiful, and they were the ones who were taking her the most. She said she once had a dream where she was nude and she was out collecting the mail. And while this was going on, a ship came over her and a beam came down to take her. And again, being a Christian, she asked Jesus for help. And her next memory was of being on a ship with a man on the table next to her. And she looked over to see the man's organs all on the outside of his body. And she began to pray. And as she did, and she was saying, Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, right? And she kept repeating that. And she said, curiously, these other beings began flicking their hands at her in an attempt to get her to stop. And in the end, the aliens had to leave the room. Now, I find this really interesting because those of you who've read, what was the book, How to Stop Alien Abduction Experiences, by that researcher who's since passed away. But anyway, I know that some people have tried prayer to stop alien abduction experiences. You know, they've white lighted themselves, they've used flower essences, they've done all sorts of things, calling on help from higher powers, etc. And when they do, these particular these experiences tend to cease, at least temporarily in many cases, and sometimes they stop altogether, which is very interesting and opens up the whole question of, well, how does that happen? What's that about? Anyway, she said to this man on the ship that they had to get out of there, but he replied, I can't go like you can. So fortunately, the ship wasn't terribly big and she found a doorway to exit, and the ship was on the ground in a park near her, so she got out. She didn't remember exactly how she got out, but remembered that she didn't need to step down too far to do so. And she started running towards her home, and she saw other naked people running too. And she got home, went to bed, woke up the next day, and checked her thoughts about what happened, thinking, gosh, didn't I? Did that really happen? What happened, you know? And I think that in these types of situations, when they're dreamlike, for a start, it's, you know, she did say she had a dream, but, you know, at the time she indicated that it seemed like it was more than a dream. And over the years, I've spoken to many, many, many hundreds of people who've said that to me. And then they've had marks on their body and all sorts of things like that. So, so it goes in a basket that is, you know, remains in the dream basket for now. And they're not even sure what those experiences were themselves. Now, the next case was of a gentleman. Now, this gentleman actually spoke at our conference in 2003, I think it was. And he used a pseudonym then, and I'm using a pseudonym now. Actually, everyone's name in this has been changed if I use a name, so obviously. So I've called him Matthew anyway, because it's easier to say, because the pseudonym he used at the conference was Elron. So I'd rather say Matthew than that. So anyway, he originally contacted us in 2000. So this goes back 20 years. And he'd been reported having been abducted by aliens from the age of 8 while living in Adelaide. And one experience he remembered was that of walking through the very solid rear door of the family home while it was shut, and then out into the backyard. Now, obviously, that's not the first time I've heard it. It's not the first time you've probably heard it. There's a case that we spent a lot of time with a gentleman who was a senior Queensland police officer. He'd had abduction experiences, and he developed strange abilities. And he reported that on one occasion he was leaving the police headquarters in Brisbane, and this gentleman's passed away since then, by the way. And as he walked out into the parking area, he walked through a row of parked motorbikes, which weren't there when he walked in. So, yeah, that was a very strange sort of experience, and he couldn't explain it, and I don't think I can explain it. But what had happened was, as he was walking out of the building into the undercover car park, he'd turned around because someone had called out to him, and he turned around and sort of said, yeah, whatever, blah, blah. And while he's doing that, he kept walking while he's speaking backwards. And then he got through, and then he realised that when he turned around again, there was a row of parked motorbikes there that he'd actually physically walked through. He couldn't explain it. He thought he was going absolutely nuts. So, and that was from a senior policeman. But anyway, so this gentleman walked through the solid rear door of the family home. And I've also had other people tell me over the years that they'd had been, you've heard them, been moved through solid bedroom walls, windows, those sorts, up through the ceiling, those sorts of things. He was then taken to a metallic grey-like room with curved walls and ceilings. A pipe poked out of the wall through which brown gas was released, which he was told would kill any bacteria. Maybe we need some of that here on Earth at the moment. Anyway, during his experiences, he'd go to a waiting room and sit with others who seemed to be paralysed. And he said small grey aliens would perform terrifying experiments on people and tell them they were friends, but he knew that they weren't. Anyway, he claimed he'd been abducted by these aliens up to 20 times for between 1 to 2 hours. And he'd often witnessed experiments being performed on other people too. And on one occasion, he decided to pretend that he'd gone a bit crazy and ran amok. So in an effort to try to escape from what he thought was a spaceship, he ran into a room where he saw a large tube filled with blue liquid and what he described as human fetuses with missing limbs floating in the liquid. He also, and that's not the first time I've heard that, he also saw humanoid beings that had been cloned and human women who were being forced to place what he described as mutants to their breasts to bond. Now, we heard a lot of that during the 1990s with the abduction cases. So that was a very interesting case, and he stood up on the stage and he told his story. Unfortunately, we don't have a video recording of that. We didn't have those facilities at the time. But it was written up in one of our journals in a conference review that I did. But now I think that's really interesting because where he talks about this brown gas that was released and he was told that would kill any bacteria, there's another case of a woman who spoke at one of our public meetings, oh gosh, probably about 5-6 years ago. I don't know if you would remember, but she said that before she was taken in, before she was allowed to hold this child, one of the beings had this sort of like a backpack and like a squirter gun, and he sprayed her down with it, and she became soaked, and then she became immediately dry. We've heard that too. Remember if some of you remember in the case of Fatima, where those hundreds of thousands of people were there and it rained, everyone got drenched, and then the UFO went over and they would instantly dry, which is very interesting. But anyway, so yeah, that's it's not the first time that we've heard of people being sprayed down or some sort of gas being put over them. I think Whitley Strieber even talked about that too before he was taken on board a spaceship at one stage. Just to kill the bacteria. And obviously they are very aware that they can be affected by bacteria and viruses from our planet, as well as in reverse too, I suppose, that we can be affected by theirs. Anyway, that wasn't the first case of human fetuses in glass jars that I heard of. And in 2003, I received another report of a similar encounter. And this is a woman I've called her Francine. She had a series of strange events that occurred during her life. And her experiences started over 30 years previously when she began to have strange dreams as well as other bizarre experiences. And one night in her late teens, she went to bed and began to dream that she'd been taken on board an alien craft and was being led along by someone holding her hand. Now, this dream was one of those dreams that seemed it was more than a dream. Anyway, she said she couldn't see who it was, but they were leading her along a walkway of which there seemed to be many rows, each above the other, like in a multi-level prison block. And on the wall were containers approximately 2 feet tall, holding fluid and containing unborn human fetuses. And I believe that David Jacobs has also spoken about this too. I tried to find some images from that he might have put together in a presentation today, but I couldn't find it. Anyway, she didn't understand what she was seeing, but she felt that she was being shown these unborn babies for a reason. And she described the craft as being immense and with many levels of these walkways. And as she was guided around the ships, she could see what she described as little people, about 3 feet tall, but she couldn't see their faces. And they were standing in front of panels of knobs and they seemed to be flying the ship. Well, that was how she put it together anyway. And she felt like the ship really was a mother craft in the real sense of the word. But the babies didn't belong to these aliens. And instead, they were traveling from world to world, introducing these babies to other populations. And we certainly have people who report close encounters who believe that their children are not quite human, for sure. And I've heard quite a few stories over the years of parents, mothers, who say that, one child is very different to the rest of the family and they seem to have different abilities. They don't seem to be like they belong in this world. They might even say as young children that you're not even my mother or my father, something like that. Anyway, I didn't know what to make of Francine's story at the time, as most of it was based on dreamlike experiences, and alone there was not much anyone can really do with that. Although she did tell me that a few years previously she'd been watching television when she witnessed a blue ball of light flash past her window. Then in 1997, while she was walking her dog in the evening, she looked up to observe a circle of iridescent green a few hundred feet away from her, moving in a circular motion. Maybe some of you have seen something like that. I don't know. I'd love to hear about that. In the circle, she could see 4 lights, 2 of which were triangular and the other 2 circular. And these lights were moving around, then they met in the middle. And the moment she saw it, she felt an instant sense of calm wash over her, but she kept walking her dog. And it appeared the circle was following her and remained the same height above as she continued home. Now, when she reached her house, it hovered above and then dramatically increased in size to match that of the house. She wasn't frightened by the experience, which seemed pretty peculiar to me, because I think I might be a little bit frightened if I saw something like that, or go, what? But it wasn't uncommon for people in such situations to report unnatural behaviour in response to these encounters, because, you know, you might, and we find that a lot. I've found that a lot over the years, that, you know, something profound will be seen by a brother and a sister, or a couple, or, you know, parent and a child, but then they never talk about it ever. And that's really strange. It's almost, I don't know whether that's a survival of the psyche mechanism, an emotional survival response, or whether something external has been used to suppress them from actually talking about it. I don't really understand that fully. But anyway, on another occasion as a child, Francine and her brother had been laying out under the stars in the backyard, and apparently it was a common habit for them to watch the stars. One night they'd seen some of the stars playing what they described as hopscotch, but it didn't seem to bother either of them or raise any questions in their minds. On another experience she reported was when she was working in a large Brisbane shopping centre, and maybe some of you have heard this story, because I have spoken about it before, so excuse me if you've heard it before. But she says one day she was busy at work serving customers when she saw a woman who seemed to have a certain air about her. And Francine described her as seeming to glide along amongst the busy shoppers. And the woman came to Francine's desk, and as she got closer, her attention was drawn to the woman's eyes. And I believe that Francine was actually working in shop mobility at the time. This is a while ago. Anyway, she's not there now. So the woman came to her desk and she was drawn to see her eyes, and she could see the irises, which were described as very grey in colour. But the extraordinary thing about her eyes was that the pupils were elongated from top to bottom. And Francine thought to herself, well, what planet are you from? And said she couldn't keep her eyes off the other woman's eyes, and feeling strongly drawn to keep looking at them. And Francine remembered the woman asked her a question, but she couldn't remember what it was. And she went on to describe this strange woman as having unstyled hair just to her ears, which was fairly straight and mousy brown in colour. She wore a dress that just seemed to hang on her, and a cardigan done up with the top button. She also carried an old-fashioned handbag over her arm. And Francine looked at the woman and thought her dress seemed to be very out of step with current fashions, more suited to her grandmother's day. Anyway, again, she thought that the woman was from another planet. And with that thought, this strange woman seemed to register it, and she quickly moved off and disappeared out of Francine's view. So, yeah, again, another strange story. And I don't really know what to make of that. If any of you have got a comment, please feel free to share. I know that at times, especially when we were getting a lot of abduction reports, there were reports of people saying that these beings who seemed to be alien, it was like they were trying to dress like humans do, but when they tried to do that, they were dressing out of style and out of time, which I found really interesting. It was like they studied the population's presentation, but they hadn't quite got it right, you know. So there was a young man who I know he went to the Sydney group's meeting because he contacted me first. He was from the Newcastle hinterland, and I know he got in touch with Mariana, the lady who was the president at the time, and she met up with him, and he had both positive experiences or negative experiences, and he believed that the positive ones would occur after the negative experiences because they would come along for healing. They would heal whatever these other extraterrestrials were doing to him. Now, I can't remember all the facts of that. I've been going through the records looking for my notes on that. I haven't come across it yet. But yeah, it's just bizarre. Some of these stories are quite bizarre. That's all I can say. And, you know, like I said in the beginning, you know, what is the UFO phenomenon? How do we put parameters around it anyway? You know, can we put parameters around it? I mean, as time goes on, we're discovering more and more that it is not just about, you know, spaceships and aliens coming from other planets. It's far more than that, and seems to be intricately entwined in people's lives in ways that we just don't understand. I have to say right from the beginning that UFO researchers have not released certain parts of people's reports because they wanted them to be taken seriously. Hey, I get that. I understand that. So they've withheld some. And that was a classic going back to the Antonio Villas-Boas case. I mean, they didn't release that to the public for 5 years. And that was of an, you know, we was taken on board a craft, had sex with an alien. I mean, can you imagine back in the day talking about sex with aliens? Who'd take you seriously? So no, they didn't release a lot of stuff. And it's only over time that researchers themselves, I think, are more willing to talk about these things, that it's helped, you know, give the public permission to come forward with other aspects of their encounters. But I do know that I've had a lot of people tell me they've had precognitive abilities to the point where it saved their life. So that's interesting. You know, I know there was one woman who said that, what did she say? She knew she was going to be shot, and she was. So unfortunately, in her case, it didn't prevent her from being shot, but she just knew that it would happen. But there are other cases where people will say, if I hadn't, you know, I'd get this voice would say, pull over, and they'd pull over just as they're going to go around a bend, and they'd pull over and this big truck would come around, those sorts of things. So that would save their life, those sorts of things. But other things, like I'd really love to see, you know, like some people say they have the healing abilities. I'd love to see that tested. I think that would be great. That would be a great push forward in giving more credence to the people's abilities, to people's experiences. And I think just the effects themselves are evidence for something happening to that person. You know, these flow-on effects, these precognition, these anyway, those ESP abilities, that in themselves is some form of evidence. Okay, so till next time, everyone. Thanks so much. It's been nice to see some of your faces. The others are hiding.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night,
Thank
all.
you.
Bye.
Bye.